If what is happening to the Panama Canal right now is not on your radar, hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch because you are going to feel this one in your grocery bill, your energy costs, and your shipping timelines. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is there, and this. Have you noticed prices on imported goods rising recently? Because if the answer is yes, part of what you're feeling may trace back to a lake in Panama that is drying up. And if you know someone in logistics, in manufacturing, in the energy sector, or just anyone who buys things, share this video. This is not an abstract story about a faraway place. It is a story about the single most important geographic choke point in the global supply chain running dry. Thank you for being here. Here is what this investigation covers: the specific engineering of the Panama Canal and why it depends entirely, not partially, not mostly, entirely, on a freshwater lake that exists only because it rains. What happened to that rainfall in 2023, what the official data showed about the lake's water level at the start of 2024, and what the Panama Canal Authority was forced to do in response. The economic cascade: how slashing daily ship transits from 36 to 18 creates a bottleneck that propagates through every supply chain touching two oceans, with specific documented consequences for energy markets, grain markets, and consumer goods from the U.S. Gulf Coast to Japan. The compound crisis: the simultaneous Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping that closed the Suez Canal to most carriers, while the Panama Canal was already throttled. The first time in the modern era that both principal interocean choke points were effectively restricted simultaneously. And the honest assessment of whether the infrastructure solutions being built will be ready before the next El Niño, which climate models project for 2027. Now, let's get into it.
Somewhere in the public imagination, global trade is a seamless, frictionless system. Cargo rising from factories, loading onto ships, and arriving at ports with the smooth predictability of a conveyor belt. The imagination is wrong. Global maritime trade is a system of choke points, narrow passages where the geometry of the Earth forces the overwhelming majority of ocean-going ships through corridors so constrained that a single disruption can reorder the flow of hundreds of billions of dollars of goods. The Panama Canal is the most consequential of those choke points, not because it is the widest passage or the deepest or the oldest, because of where it sits and what it connects. The 51-mile artificial waterway that cuts across the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Panama connects the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean on one side with the Pacific Ocean on the other. For a ship traveling from the port of Houston, Texas, to the port of Yokohama, Japan, the alternative to the Panama Canal is a 20,000-mile journey around the southern tip of South America, adding roughly 30 additional days of sailing time and approximately $30,000 in fuel costs per day to every voyage. For a ship moving liquefied natural gas from the U.S. Gulf Coast to Korea, the canal is not merely convenient. It is the difference between a commercially viable trade route and one that makes the economics of the shipment unworkable. The Panama Canal Authority, the Panamanian government agency that has operated the canal since the 1999 transfer from the United States, handles approximately 13,000 to 14,000 vessel transits per year in normal operations. That is roughly 40 ships per day, most of them taking between 8 and 10 hours to complete the passage. In terms of the cargo those ships carry, the canal accounts for approximately 6% of global maritime trade by volume. The U.S. Bureau of Transportation Statistics data for 2023 shows that the U.S. alone accounts for over 70% of total canal traffic, either originating or terminating in American ports. The Asia to U.S. East Coast Trade Lane, the pathway connecting Chinese factories, Korean semiconductor plants, and Japanese auto manufacturers to the American consumer, accounts for approximately 42% of total canal traffic. Approximately $270 billion in cargo passes through the Panama Canal each year. That is not the value of the canal infrastructure. It is the value of the goods that move through it annually. The infrastructure itself, the locks, the channels, the electrical systems, the towing locomotives that guide ships through, is irreplaceable on any short timeline. The Suez Canal Authority Managing Director has a contingency plan for Suez disruptions. The Maritime Administration has contingency plans for coastal shipping lane disruptions. Nobody has a realistic contingency plan for the Panama Canal because there is no other route that covers the same function in the same geography. This is the fundamental vulnerability that the drought of 2023 exposed. The most critical single link in the global supply chain is operated entirely by gravity and rain. Most people who know the Panama Canal exists do not know why it requires fresh water to operate. The mental model is of a ditch. Dig a hole across the isthmus, fill it with ocean water, and let ships cross. The actual engineering is both more ingenious and more vulnerable, and understanding the vulnerability requires understanding the ingenuity. Panama sits at the narrowest point of Central America, but it is not flat. The Continental Divide, the spine of mountains that runs the length of the Americas, crosses Panama at elevations of several hundred feet above sea level. A sea level canal, like the Suez Canal in Egypt, which crosses a flat desert, was the original French ambition. The French failed, and the Americans who completed the project between 1904 and 1914 ultimately chose a radically different design. Instead of a sea level cut, American chief engineer John Frank Stevens insisted on a lock system, a staircase of water chambers that would lift ships up to the level of a large artificial lake, let them cross the lake at altitude, and then lower them back down to sea level on the other side. The lake that had to be created for this system, Gatún Lake, required damming the Chagres River on the Atlantic side of the isthmus. At the time of its construction, Gatún Lake was the largest artificial lake in the world. It sits 26 meters, approximately 85 feet, above sea level, and ships crossing the isthmus spend the middle portion of their transit traversing the lake's surface before being lowered back to sea level. Here is the engineering detail that makes the drought story so consequential. The locks work entirely by gravity. To raise a ship at the Gatún locks on the Atlantic side, for example, the ship enters the first of 3 lock chambers at sea level, massive watertight gates close behind it. Valve is open and water from Gatún Lake, which sits above the lock system, flows downward through culverts in the walls and floor of the chamber, filling it from below. In approximately 8 minutes, 26.7 million gallons of water rush into the chamber, raising the ship to the next level. The process repeats twice more. At the top, the ship is at lake level and proceeds across the water. On the Pacific side, the process runs in reverse. The same water that rose with the ship drains away to sea level, lowering the ship back down. Every single ship that transits the Panama Canal consumes approximately 52 million gallons of fresh water, not counting the water carried in the ship's ballast tanks or cargo holds, but purely as the operating fluid of the lock system itself. That water comes from Gatún Lake. After it is used to raise or lower ships, it flows into the ocean. There is no pump system to return it to the lake. There is no recycling mechanism in the original locks. The only way fresh water returns to Gatún Lake is if it rains on the Panamanian watershed. The Panama Canal Authority uses approximately 7 billion liters of fresh water per day to operate the lock systems. Ricourt Vasquez, the administrator of the Panama Canal Authority, described this in a widely reported statement. We use about 2.5 times the amount of water a city of the size of New York uses for the canal operation. The comparison is clarifying. New York City, 9 million people, one of the largest and most water-intensive urban centers in the world, uses a fraction of the water that the Panama Canal consumes just to keep ships moving. And Gatún Lake is not a deep, stable reservoir with centuries of buffered storage capacity. It is a shallow, rain-fed lake whose level is directly and rapidly responsive to rainfall patterns in the Chagres River watershed. In a normal year, Panama receives abundant rainfall during its May to December rainy season. The country is the 5th wettest in the world, receiving as much as 16 feet of rain annually in some regions. The rainy season typically ends with Gatún Lake at approximately 88 feet of elevation, its full operational level. As the January to April dry season proceeds, the lake level gradually drops through the period of maximum ship transits. The system was designed to work within this seasonal cycle. The critical threshold is 79 feet. Below that level, the Panama Canal Authority's own documentation specifies that the canal must restrict maximum allowable draft, the depth to which a ship's hull extends below the water surface, meaning ships must carry less cargo to keep their bottoms from scraping the shallow channels. Below about 77 feet, the authority must also start reducing the number of daily transits, because each transit consumes a fixed amount of water that cannot be replenished fast enough from a depleted lake. The engineering that makes the canal possible, the gravity-fed lock system, contains within it an inescapable constraint. The gravity only works when there is water to be fed. In 2023, Panama received 30% less rainfall than average. October, historically one of the wettest months, typically responsible for replenishing the lake toward its full level before the dry season, recorded 41% less rainfall than normal. When December's modest rains arrived, they were insufficient to compensate for 8 months of deficit. And on January 1st to 2024, the water level in Gatún Lake was lower than on any previous 1st of January in the lake's recorded history, nearly 6 feet lower than January 1st, 2023 had been. The canal was operating in crisis conditions, and the global supply chain was about to feel every drop of that deficit. The drought that produced the 2023 Gatún Lake crisis was not a random meteorological fluke. It was a compound event, the intersection of a natural climate pattern with the amplifying effects of greenhouse gas-driven warming that the World Weather Attribution Service analyzed in a rapid attribution study published in May 2024. Panama is normally one of the wettest countries on Earth. Its position at the juncture of the Pacific and Caribbean moisture systems typically produces abundant rainfall year-round, with the May to December rainy season delivering the bulk of the Chagres River watershed's annual water budget. The country's extreme rainfall reliability is the reason the lock-based canal design was feasible in the first place. Engineer Stevens's choice of a lock system over a sea level cut was predicated on the assumption that Panama's rainfall would keep Gatún Lake reliably full. For most of the canal's history, that assumption held. 2023 was Panama's third driest year on record since comprehensive records began. The deficit was not concentrated in a single month or a single watershed. It was sustained across the entire rainy season from May through December, with the watershed area above Gatún Lake recording below average rainfall in 7 of 8 months. The World Weather Attribution analysis found that rainfall in the Chagres watershed during the critical May to December rainy season was 30% below average, with October recording 41% below average. By the time the dry season began in January 2024, the lake was operating on a water budget that left it approximately 6 feet below its January 1st level from the year before. What 30% below average means in the physical reality of a rain-fed lake is not always intuitive. It means not that it barely rained, but that the cumulative rainfall deficit, day after day, week after week, across 8 months, produced a water shortfall in the lake that was never compensated by any individual heavy rainfall event. Panama had storms in 2023, it had rain. It simply did not have enough rain distributed across enough of the watershed for enough weeks to bring the lake close to its normal seasonal level. The cumulative nature of a rain-fed reservoir's water budget is precisely what makes it so vulnerable to a sustained anomaly. There is no mechanism to catch up quickly. Each week of deficit compounds the prior week's deficit, and the lake's level reflects the sum of every rainfall anomaly across the entire rainy season. The attribution question, why did this happen, produces a nuanced answer. The World Weather Attribution team found that the drought was unlikely without the influence of El Niño. El Niño is a natural climate pattern driven by anomalous warming of surface waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean that recurs every 2 to 7 years, typically lasting 9 to 12 months. When El Niño is active, it shifts atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that reduce rainfall across Central America, including Panama's Chagres watershed. The 2023 El Niño was a strong event by historical standards, contributing meaningfully to the rainfall deficit that depleted Gatún Lake. But El Niño alone does not fully explain the severity of what happened. The Woodwell Climate Research Center's analysis noted that the 2023 drought was being affected by the combination of a strong El Niño and record-breaking global warming. In 2023, the global average temperature exceeded the pre-industrial baseline by 1.35 degrees Celsius, the highest such departure ever recorded at that time. Warmer background temperatures increase evaporation from the lake surface, reducing effective water storage even when some rainfall does occur. Warmer temperatures also alter atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that modulate rainfall distribution across the tropics. The World Weather Attribution team found that under current climate conditions with approximately 1.2 degrees of human-caused warming, there is approximately a 5% chance of a drought of the 2023 magnitude occurring in an El Niño year. This means, given the observed frequency of El Niño years, similar events are now expected approximately once every 40 years in the current climate. Under pre-industrial conditions without human warming, the event would have been far less likely. Without the global warming trend, the 2023 drought of this magnitude would effectively not occur. What made the 2023 event operationally unique was the combination of severity and timing. The canal had experienced drought-related restrictions before. In 2015 and 2016, another El Niño year, draft restrictions were imposed between April and June. In 2019, a drought reduced Gatún Lake to its lowest level on record at that point. But the 2023 and early 2024 period produced the sustained multi-month deficit that pushed the lake to its lowest January level ever recorded, and did so during a period when global demand for canal transit was high, when the only alternative shipping route through the Suez Canal was about to be disrupted by geopolitical events, and when the canal's own operational decisions amplified the crisis rather than containing it. The human dimension of the drought's cause matters for the future risk assessment. The World Weather Attribution Analysis found no significant long-term drying trend in historical rainfall data for the Panama Canal watershed. This finding suggests that the 2023 event was not primarily the product of a detectably established secular drying trend in Panama. It was primarily the product of El Niño's natural variability, amplified by the warming background. This distinction carries an important implication. If the rainfall deficit were part of a clear secular trend, the future trajectory would be clearly one of progressive deterioration. If it is primarily El Niño driven, the future trajectory depends on whether El Niño events become more frequent or more intense under warming, which the evidence and modeling suggest they do. Samuel Munoz, a scientist at Northeastern University who published the definitive climate projection study for Gatún Lake in Geophysical Research Letters in September 2025, stated the trajectory clearly. The canal is vulnerable to drought. That vulnerability increases with climate change. The models think that the more we warm things, the more severe and frequent these droughts become in Panama. His study found that under higher emissions scenarios, the occurrence of historic droughts like 2023 would double by the end of the century. The Panama Canal Authority's response to the declining Gatún Lake level in 2023 was progressive and documented in a series of official advisories. A paper trail that shows, in precise operational terms, how a freshwater deficit in a specific Panamanian watershed translated into a global shipping crisis. In July 2023, the authority issued the first restrictions, a reduction in the maximum allowable draft from the normal 50 feet to 44 feet for container vessels. The draft restriction meant that large container ships, which are designed to ride low in the water under full load to maximize cargo efficiency, had to sail lighter. A ship that would normally carry 3,000 containers across the Pacific with a 50-foot draft could now only carry enough cargo to maintain a 44-foot draft, approximately a 15 to 20% reduction in cargo per transit. The ship still got through, but it got through carrying less. By late July, the authority began water-saving measures that went beyond draft restrictions, stricter scheduling of transit times, conservation protocols in the lock operation, and the beginning of a rationing of daily transit slots. The normal 36 to 38 vessels per day began declining in steps, to 32, then 31. By November 2023, the authority announced that daily transits would be capped at 25 slots through at least April 2024. In practice, the actual daily transit count dropped further, reaching a nadir of 18 vessels per day by February 2024, according to the Project 44 Maritime Intelligence data. 18 ships per day, against a normal operating capacity of 36 to 38. The Project 44 data and the Panama Canal Authority's own statistics document the magnitude of the disruption. Vessel transits dropped from the normal 36 to 38 vessels in July 2023 to just 18 per day by February 2024. These restrictions persisted well into 2024, with full operational capacity only restored by August 2024, more than a year after the initial restrictions began. The Panama Canal Authority reported a 29% drop in vessel transits during fiscal year 2024 compared to the prior year. The breakdown by vessel type reveals where the restrictions bit hardest. Container vessels, the workhorse of consumer goods trade, proved relatively resilient compared to other categories, with monthly counts dropping from a pre-drought level of 300 to 330 vessels per month to approximately 250 during the peak restriction period. But liquid bulk carriers, the ships that move liquefied natural gas, liquefied petroleum gas, and chemical cargoes, were devastated. LNG carriers experienced a 66% drop in canal transits over fiscal year 2024. Dry bulk carriers, the vessels carrying grain, coal, and fertilizer, were down 107% in some reporting periods. The draft restrictions hit large, heavy vessels most severely, and LNG tankers, bulk carriers, and very large gas carriers are all categories that typically ride deep in the water. The two-directional nature of the restriction created a scheduling geometry that compounded the problem. With limited daily slots, ships seeking to cross the canal faced waiting times that stretched from the normal 2-day queue to 2 and 3 weeks or more for vessels without advance reservations. By late August 2023, approximately 135 ships were waiting to cross, 50% more than the normal queue. Ships without reservations faced what the authority described as indefinite delays. The uncertainty was not merely about timing. It was about whether a slot would become available at all before a shipping company's contractual obligations or cargo perishability made waiting economically untenable. The authorities' response to the capacity constraint created an unintended financial market, transit slot auctions. Because the reservation system guaranteed a crossing date for ships that had booked in advance, when an advance reservation ship dropped out of its scheduled slot, that slot became available for auction. The auction results documented in Lloyd's List and other trade publications were extraordinary. A single, very large gas carrier operator paid $4 million for a transit slot in November 2023. Other operators paid $1 million to $2 million. The standard transit fee for a large vessel, already in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, was being supplemented by millions of dollars in auction premiums just to guarantee movement through a single geographic point. The Houston-Chiba route, a major pathway for liquefied petroleum gas from the U.S. Gulf Coast to Japan, reached rates of $250 per metric ton by September 2024, described by market analysts as an all-time high for that corridor. For context, that rate represented a multiple of the pre-restriction norm, and the cost increase was being passed through to every downstream buyer of the gas. The Panama Canal drought of 2023 would have been a severe disruption to global shipping in any context. It occurred in a context that turned a severe disruption into something closer to a global logistics emergency. In November 2023, Houthi forces in Yemen began targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea, the maritime approach to the Suez Canal from the south. The Suez Canal is the other major inter-ocean chokepoint of comparable strategic importance to the Panama Canal. Where the Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific, the Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, enabling the flow of goods between Europe and Asia without the 20,000-mile journey around the southern tip of Africa. In 2023 and 2024, approximately 12% of global trade by volume transited the Suez Canal, roughly twice the Panama Canal's share, but in a different geographic configuration. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea prompted the world's largest shipping companies, Maersk, MSC, KMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, to suspend Red Sea transits beginning in late December 2023. By January 2024, the Red Sea route was effectively closed to Western carriers, with ships rerouting around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies documented the combined disruption. With droughts restricting shipping via the Panama Canal since mid-2023, the attacks on vessels in the Red Sea have caused a complete cessation in LNG shipping between Europe and Asia via the Suez Canal. This disruption primarily affects LNG supply from the United States, Qatar, Russia, and North Africa. This was a historically unprecedented compound event. For the first time in the modern era of containerized global trade, both of the two primary inter-ocean maritime shortcuts were severely restricted simultaneously. The Panama Canal was operating at approximately half capacity due to water shortage. The Suez Canal was closed to most Western carriers due to security threat. The only alternative for ships needing to cross between oceans was to circumnavigate Africa, the route that global trade had specifically spent a century and hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure investment to avoid. The UNCTAD Review of Maritime Transport 2024 documented the consequences. Rerouting vessel capacity around Africa's Cape of Good Hope surged by 89%. A typical large container ship carrying 20,000 to 24,000 20-foot equivalent units on the Far East to Europe route incurred an additional $400,000 in emissions costs per voyage under the European Union's emissions trading system, when diverting around Africa instead of using the Suez Canal, before adding fuel, crew wages, insurance premiums, and increased journey time costs. By mid-2024, rerouting away from the Red Sea and Panama Canal had increased global container ship demand by 12%, not because more goods were being shipped, but because more ships were required to cover the longer distances at the same cargo throughput. The UNCTAD analysis projected that if the increase in container freight rates observed between October 2023 and June 2024 continued through the end of 2025, global consumer prices could rise by 0.6% by late 2025. With small island developing states potentially facing a 0.9% increase and processed food prices rising by 1.3% in those most vulnerable economies. These are aggregate numbers that mask the specific commodity-by-commodity price increases that hit producers and consumers in particular supply chains. For U.S. agricultural exporters, the compound disruption landed in the worst possible way. The CHS Inc. Agricultural Co-Cooperative documented that for the 2022 fall shipping season, 85% of its grain shipments destined for Asia and originating from the U.S. Gulf Coast had passed through the Panama Canal. In the same period of 2023, after the restrictions began, only 15% used the Panama Canal route.
Bulk carriers moving U.S. grain from Gulf Coast ports to Asian buyers shifted overwhelmingly to the Cape of Good Hope route, adding 30% more time and 30% more fuel to every voyage. Every extra day at sea for a bulk carrier cost approximately $30,000. Those costs did not disappear into the abstraction of logistics economics. They were priced into the grain, and the grain buyers, governments and companies feeding hundreds of millions of people in Asia, paid more for American agricultural exports during the period of the crisis.
Imagine a highway with 4 lanes suddenly reduced to 2. The cars already in the 2 remaining lanes move at normal speed. But the cars waiting to enter, backed up behind the merger point, face a wait that grows with every vehicle that joins the queue. If the wait becomes long enough, some drivers find alternate routes. Others pay a premium to use a carpool lane. Others simply sit in the queue, unable to reroute because their destination is on the other side of a geographic choke point with no practical alternative. This highway metaphor describes with reasonable precision what happened at the Panama Canal's entry points. The Limon Bay anchorage on the Atlantic side and the Gulf of Panama anchorage on the Pacific side, from the late summer of 2023 through the first half of 2024. By late August 2023, approximately 135 ships were waiting to cross the canal at any given time. Under normal operations, the queue is typically around 90 vessels. The 50% increase in waiting vessels produced a waiting time that grew from the normal 2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 weeks for ships without advance reservations. Those waiting ships were not parked on their anchorages for free. Every day, a ship sits at anchor, burns fuel for hotel power, electricity for the crew, refrigeration for cargo, navigation systems. A large container ship burning fuel at anchor costs its operator $20,000 to $30,000 per day in fuel alone, before crew wages, port fees, and the opportunity cost of not carrying cargo on a different route. Multiply that by 135 ships waiting an average of 2 weeks, and the direct holding cost runs to tens of millions of dollars per day across the waiting fleet. Those costs were being borne initially by shipping companies, and then passed through as surcharges to the freight customers who needed their goods moved. The auction system that the Panama Canal Authority introduced to manage the scarcity of transit slots created what economists call a price discovery mechanism, but in practice functioned as a toll gate set by desperation rather than market equilibrium. Ships transiting without a reservation were not merely subject to delays. They were subject to indefinite delays, as the authority's own advisory phrased it. For time-sensitive cargo, fresh fruit, refrigerated pharmaceuticals, just-in-time manufacturing components, indefinite delay is effectively a cargo write-off. The willingness to pay $4 million for a single transit slot reflects not irrationality but a calculated comparison. $4 million for a guaranteed crossing versus $20,000 or $30,000 per day of indefinite waiting multiplied by an uncertain number of weeks, with cargo potentially spoiling or contract penalties potentially accruing every day. The McKinsey analysis of the Panama Canal restrictions, published in January 2024, estimated that there could be nearly 4,000 fewer Panama Canal crossings annually as a result of the restrictions if trade patterns remained unchanged from pre-restriction norms. McKinsey further estimated that approximately 2,000 annual transits, primarily involving dry bulk carriers and roll-on, roll-off ships, could divert away from the Panama Canal to alternative routes. The remaining 2,000 unreplaced transits represented cargo that simply did not move, was significantly delayed, or arrived via routes so expensive that the economics of the underlying trade were fundamentally altered. The energy sector felt the Panama Canal drought before almost any other industry, and the consequences persisted long after the canal's operational recovery in August 2024. The reason is structural. The LNG trade routes that existed before the drought were not simply routes of convenience. They were routes around which entire investment frameworks, long-term purchase agreements, and national energy security strategies had been built. Liquefied natural gas is natural gas that has been cooled to approximately negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, reducing its volume by a factor of roughly 600. This compression makes it possible to ship natural gas aboard specialized tankers, LNG carriers, rather than requiring the fixed pipeline infrastructure that land-based natural gas delivery depends on. The United States, following its shale gas revolution and the development of major LNG export terminals on the Gulf Coast and in the Sabine Pass area of Louisiana and Texas, became the world's largest LNG exporter in 2023. The primary markets for that LNG are in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, where natural gas is used extensively for electricity generation, and where the memory of the 2011 Fukushima disaster produced a sustained shift away from nuclear power that increased gas demand dramatically. The standard route from U.S. Gulf Coast LNG export terminals to Japan, before the Panama Canal drought, ran east from the Gulf, through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Caribbean, and into the Panama Canal. The full transit, including the canal crossing, took approximately 25 to 30 days, with the canal effectively closed to LNG traffic during the height of the restrictions. LNG carriers face additional transit restrictions even in normal conditions, limited to 2 transits per day and prohibited from nighttime transit due to the nature of their cargo. The alternative route ran east from the Gulf across the Atlantic, around the southern tip of Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to Japan. That journey adds approximately 20 days to the transit time. The SynMax intelligence analysis documented that in 2024, 94% of U.S. LNG destined for Asia used the Cape of Good Hope route. For Japan specifically, which had previously depended on the Panama Canal for 66% of its LNG imports from the United States, with the Cape of Good Hope accounting for only 13%, the shift was essentially total. 81% of U.S. LNG cargoes to Japan transited via the Cape of Good Hope in 2024, a dramatic reversal of the pre-drought routing pattern. The consequence of adding 20 days to the transit time for LNG cargo is not simply that buyers receive their gas 20 days later. It is that the same fleet of ships must now be deployed across a longer route to deliver the same volume of gas. A ship that was completing 2 round trips between the Gulf Coast and Japan per quarter can now complete fewer round trips over the same period. To maintain the same delivery volume, either more ships are required, adding capital cost and charter rate pressure, or delivery commitments are not fully met, creating supply shortfalls and price spikes in buyer markets. LNG transit restrictions at the Panama Canal had existed even before the drought. The canal imposes a limit of 2 LNG transits per day, 1 northbound and 1 southbound, due to safety restrictions related to the nature of LNG cargo, and LNG carriers are excluded from nighttime transit. The Lloyd's List analysis by Alexio Duber of Jax Panama noted that LNG shipping had not fully returned to pre-drought Panama Canal transit levels even after the drought restrictions eased, partly because LNG shippers had become accustomed to the Cape of Good Hope route during the crisis period and found it offered greater predictability. Many of the LPG and LNG players have now become accustomed to the route around the Cape of Good Hope. It works and it's predictable. The behavioral shift in LNG routing from a canal-dependent model to a Cape of Good Hope model was not a temporary disruption response. It was a structural realignment of one of the world's most important energy trade routes, triggered by a freshwater shortage in a single lake in Panama. The grain trade disruption produced by the Panama Canal drought operates through a different mechanism than the LNG disruption, but converges on the same fundamental problem. The single choke point that the world built its shipping economics around is no longer reliably available. The United States Gulf Coast is the world's most important export origin for grains and oilseeds. The Port of New Orleans, the Port of Houston, the Port of Corpus Christi. These are the terminals from which American corn, soybeans, wheat, and sorghum flow outward to feed animals, humans, and biofuel refineries across the globe. For the Asian buyers who represent the most important destination for American grain exports, China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Panama Canal was the logical route. A bulk carrier departing New Orleans with a hold full of soybeans bound for Shanghai would normally pass through the canal, traverse the Pacific, and arrive in approximately 30 days total transit time. Without the canal, either because of restricted slots, draft limitations making it impossible for a full-loaded bulker to transit, or auction premiums making the canal uneconomical, that same bulk carrier has 2 alternatives. It can sail west, across the Atlantic, around Africa, and into the Pacific, approximately 50 to 60 days total transit time. Or it can sail east, across the Pacific after offloading at a West Coast port via rail, which involves the inefficiency of a mode transfer and the cost and delay of a transcontinental rail journey added to an ocean crossing. The CHS Inc. Agricultural Cooperative data, comparing the 85% share of Gulf to Asia grain shipments that used the Panama Canal in 2022 with the 15% that used it in 2023, is perhaps the single most dramatic data point in the entire crisis. In one season, the routing geography of American grain exports to Asia was essentially inverted. Ships that would have transited the canal were instead sailing around Africa, adding a cost of roughly $30,000 per day per vessel for the additional days at sea. Those costs propagate through the grain supply chain in a direction that always ends at the consumer. The bulk carrier's operator charges higher freight rates to offset increased fuel and time costs. The grain trading company that chartered the carrier absorbs some of that increase as a margin compression and passes the rest through as a higher delivered price to the buyer. The buyer, typically a feed mill operator, a soy processing facility, or a grain importer, builds the higher input cost into their product prices. The product ultimately becomes food, and the food is more expensive. The agricultural basis, the difference between the local cash price of grain and the futures contract price, reflects these shipping costs in real time. During the canal restrictions, U.S. Gulf basis deteriorated as exporters competed for the limited transit slots, with some sellers accepting lower prices to secure priority passage rather than selling at market price and accepting indefinite delays. The basis deterioration represented a direct transfer of economic value from American farmers to the logistics system, a tax, in economic terms, on every ton of grain that moved through the crisis period. The transit slot auction system that the Panama Canal Authority operated during the drought restrictions has a specific set of winners and losers that the financial press reported extensively, but that the broader public rarely understood. The winners and losers are not who most people assume. The operators who paid millions of dollars per transit slot for a guaranteed crossing are not anonymous victims of market forces. They are, overwhelmingly, the operators of vessels carrying high-value, time-sensitive cargoes whose clients were willing to pay extraordinary premiums for reliable delivery. An LPG carrier delivering propane to a Korean petrochemical refinery under a take-or-pay contract, a contract that specifies penalties for late delivery, has a precise financial calculation to make. What is the penalty for missing the delivery window versus what does it cost to buy the transit slot at auction? When the penalty calculation favors the auction happens. When it does not, the ship waits in the queue. The economic logic of the auction system means that the highest value cargoes move first. Energy cargoes, LNG, LPG, liquid bulk fuels, move because refineries and power plants cannot stop operating while they wait for ships. Pharmaceutical components and medical supplies move because the penalty for missing production schedules at a major pharmaceutical manufacturer exceeds the auction price. Consumer goods, clothing, electronics, furniture, wait because no individual container of clothing justifies $1 million transit premium when the cargo can sit in a warehouse for 3 weeks without spoiling. The consequence of this cargo triage is a specific, predictable distribution of economic pain. The industries that move the highest value, most time-sensitive products are protected. They pay more, but they get their goods through. The industries that move lower value, less time-sensitive goods, including many categories of consumer merchandise, many agricultural commodities, and much of the raw material trade, absorb the delays and pass the resulting cost increases through to end consumers. The UNCTAD analysis projected a 0.6% increase in global consumer prices from the compound Suez-Panama disruption through the end of 2025. That number sounds modest as a percentage. Applied to global GDP, it represents hundreds of billions of dollars of real purchasing power transferred from consumers to logistics operators, from normal economic activity to crisis management. And it falls disproportionately on the countries least able to absorb it, the small island developing states and least developed countries that UNCTAD identified as facing 0.9% consumer price increases, with processed food prices rising 1.3%. The disruption to Panama's own economy deserves specific mention. Canal revenue constitutes a critical fraction of the Panamanian government's budget. The fees paid by ships transiting the canal flow to the Panama Canal Authority and, through revenue transfers, to Panama's treasury. During the drought restrictions, total transit volumes fell 29% in fiscal year 2024. Despite the unprecedented auction premiums that some ships paid, with individual slot auctions reaching $4 million, the Panama Canal Authority's total revenue for the period actually increased modestly compared to prior years, reaching $3.38 billion, approximately $30 million above the prior year. The canal earned more money per transit because of the auction system, while carrying 29% fewer transits overall. A financial result that illustrates the extraordinary value of the service the canal provides and the extraordinary cost that constraints on that service impose on the global economy. By August 2024, the Panama Canal Authority declared that full operational capacity had been restored. The Panamanian rainy season of 2024 delivered sufficient rainfall to replenish Gatún Lake. The daily transit cap was progressively relaxed from its February nadir of 18 ships per day back toward the normal 36, and the 600-plus day waiting times began contracting toward their pre-drought norms. The Project 44 Maritime's intelligence data shows that average transit times through the canal stabilized within a 45-minute range during the recovery period, even as berthing times at adjacent ports fluctuated with the surge of vessels seeking passage after months of restriction. The canal was operationally recovered. And here is the turn that most coverage of this story did not make. Operational recovery at the canal did not undo the structural changes that the crisis had forced upon the global shipping industry. The LNG trade routes did not revert to their pre-drought configuration. LNG operators who had adapted to the Cape of Good Hope route during the crisis period, building crew rotations, charter arrangements, and customer delivery schedules around a route that did not depend on the canal, had little incentive to reassume dependence on an infrastructure system that had just demonstrated 18 months of unreliability. The SINMAX data showed that LNG transit through the Panama Canal had not recovered to pre-drought levels even after water restrictions eased. The behavioral change had become structural. This structural stickiness has specific consequences that market participants have begun pricing into long-term planning. Asian LNG buyers who had historically relied on the Panama Canal route to receive U.S. Gulf Coast LNG built their import terminal capacity, their LNG carrier charter agreements, and their supply security frameworks around a transit time of approximately 25 to 30 days. The Cape of Good Hope route adds approximately 20 days to that transit, extending the effective lead time from month to month and a half. That extended lead time requires either more gas storage capacity at the destination terminal, more LNG carrier capacity in the charter fleet, or acceptance of greater supply variability. All three options cost money. The money is already being spent. The grain trade showed similar stickiness. Exporters who had developed relationships with Cape of Good Hope routed carriers, who had negotiated new freight terms based on the longer route's cost basis, and whose buyers had sourced alternative suppliers during the crisis period were not automatically reassembled into their pre-drought trade configurations. Market relationships that take years to build take time to rebuild after being disrupted. Asian grain buyers who developed supply relationships with Brazilian, Argentine, and Australian agricultural exporters during the period when U.S. Gulf Coast grain was difficult to route cost-effectively do not immediately abandon those diversified supply chains when the Panama Canal reopens. The diversification itself has value. A buyer who depends on a single supply route through a single choke point has learned, at the cost of 2023 and 2024 supply disruptions, exactly what that dependence is worth when the choke point fails.
The compound disruption with the Suez Canal, still subject to Houthi-related security threats through the period of this investigation, meant that the fundamental redundancy of the global shipping system remained compromised. In the pre-crisis world, a ship unable to use the Panama Canal could route through Suez. A ship unable to use Suez could route through Panama. The simultaneous restriction of both choke points had demonstrated that the global shipping system lacks robust redundancy against compound events. And the next El Niño cycle, expected by climate models in approximately 2027, will arrive before any of the infrastructure solutions now under construction are complete. That is the investigation's central open loop, and it is the question that Chunk 4 will assess. What is actually being built to prevent a recurrence? Will it be ready in time? And what does an honest three-scenario analysis tell us about where this goes?
The Panama Canal Authority's primary announced response to the 2023 drought crisis is the construction of a new dam and reservoir on the Indio River, a watercourse to the west of Gatún Lake that has not previously been incorporated into the canal's water supply system. The project was approved by the Panamanian government in January 2025 with an estimated cost of $1.6 billion. The basic design is a dam on the Indio River that would create a new reservoir holding approximately 1.25 billion cubic meters of water. A tunnel would be drilled through the intervening mountain range to connect the new reservoir to Gatún Lake, providing a supplemental water supply during dry seasons or drought years. The Canal Authority has projected that the new reservoir would provide water for up to 15 additional daily transits during the dry season, potentially the difference between the 18 transit per day nadir of February 2024 and a more manageable 22 to 25. The construction timeline is the problem. Construction is expected to begin in 2027. The project is not expected to be completed until 2032. The next El Niño, which climate models from NOAA and independent meteorological services are projecting for approximately 2027, will arrive before construction begins. A fully funded, approved, politically supported infrastructure project designed specifically to prevent a recurrence of the 2023 crisis will not be in the ground when the next El Niño cycle begins. The Indio River Dam project faces additional complications beyond timeline. The Indio River Basin contains relatively undisturbed ecosystems, forests, freshwater habitats, and biodiversity that environmental groups have documented in assessments submitted to the Panamanian environmental review process. The dam would flood approximately 4,600 hectares of land, submerging forests and displacing approximately 2,500 residents from communities in the affected area. The project's January 2025 approval included $400 million in the $1.6 billion budget specifically for compensating and relocating those residents. Environmental and indigenous rights organizations have mounted formal objections to the project, arguing that the affected communities were not adequately consulted in the approval process and that the ecological destruction of the Indio River basin, including the loss of forest cover that itself contributes to the watershed's rainfall and water retention capacity, may undermine the long-term water security that the dam is intended to provide. Greenly.Earth's analysis of the project notes that as of mid-2025, it remains under review, with construction not expected before 2027 regardless of legal challenges. There is also a statutory complication. The construction of new reservoirs by the Canal Authority was prohibited by Panama's Law No. 28 of 2006, a law enacted in the context of the 2010 canal expansion to protect watershed land uses. Proceeding with the Indio River Dam required amending that law, a process that Panama's National Assembly completed ahead of the project's approval. But the legal history is relevant. The same statutory protection that had to be removed to allow this project could theoretically be reinstated by a future legislature, adding political uncertainty to the project's already challenged timeline. The older Panamax locks, the original 1914 lock system, lose approximately 50 to 52 million gallons of fresh water per vessel transit, all of which flows to the ocean. The newer Neo-Panamax locks, constructed as part of the 2016 expansion, reclaim approximately 60% of that water through water-saving basins that recirculate water between adjacent lock chambers rather than releasing it to the sea. The Canal Authority has noted that improving water utilization efficiency in the existing lock systems, reducing water loss per transit by 15 to 20%, can partially offset drought-driven reductions in available water. But efficiency improvements in the existing infrastructure can only do so much when the underlying lake level is falling due to insufficient rainfall across an entire watershed. The Canal Authority's second major announced adaptation strategy is structurally different from the dam project. It addresses not the water supply problem but the route dependency that makes the water supply problem so consequential for specific cargo types. In April 2025, the Canal Authority began the pre-qualification process for private concessionaires to design and build a natural gas liquids pipeline, a land-based conduit that would carry NGL cargo across the isthmus from Pacific to Atlantic without requiring transit through the canal's lock system. The project, described by Canal Administrator Ricord Vasquez as a flagship element of Panama's adaptation strategy, would allow LNG and LPG cargo to cross the isthmus even when water restrictions prevent large gas tankers from using the locks. The pipeline concept addresses a specific vulnerability. LNG carriers are among the largest vessels that transit the canal, riding deep in the water and requiring the highest water levels to maintain adequate underkeel clearance. They are the first vessel category to face transit restrictions when draft limits are imposed. And as documented by the Lloyd's List analysis, LNG operators have been particularly reluctant to resume dependence on the canal even after water restrictions eased, partly because of the canal's strict 2-per-day cap on LNG transits that exists regardless of water levels. A dedicated pipeline would allow U.S. LNG exports to Asia to cross Panama without water dependency and without the LNG-specific transit caps. Administrator Vasquez noted that transit time via the pipeline would be competitive with canal transit and that reliability would be substantially higher because it is not water dependent. The reliability argument is the central appeal. Asian LNG buyers who built their import infrastructure and long-term supply agreements around a canal-dependent U.S. Gulf Coast supply assumed a certain delivery reliability. The 2023 to 2024 crisis demonstrated that the reliability assumption was not robust. A pipeline that can operate independently of rainfall patterns in Panama's Chagres watershed provides a more durable guarantee. Like the Indio River Dam, the pipeline project is not operational yet. The pre-qualification process that began in April 2025 has multiple stages: design, environmental review, financing, construction, before any gas moves through any pipe. The project is not expected to be operational before the next El Niño cycle begins. It is a medium-term solution to a problem that exists today and will be tested again in the not-distant future. This investigation has been tracking a story with a specific physical mechanism. Drought depletes a lake depletion constrains ship transits, transit constraints propagate through global supply chains. And that clear physical mechanism might tempt the conclusion that the path forward is obvious. The problem is water shortage. The solution is more water storage. And once the dam is built, everything returns to normal. This framing deserves direct engagement because the evidence supports a more complicated and ultimately more honest assessment. The case against treating this as a purely climate-driven crisis of inevitable escalation runs as follows. The World Weather Attribution Analysis did not find a significant long-term drying trend in rainfall over Panama. The drought of 2023 was severe, and El Niño was identified as a primary driver, but El Niño is a natural climate cycle that has affected Panama throughout the canal's history. The canal has operated through multiple El Niño events since 1914, including the 2015 to 2016 event that produced a previous round of draft restrictions, and has generally recovered to normal operations after each event. The 5% probability of a 2023 magnitude drought in any given El Niño year, as calculated by the World Weather Attribution Team, is a risk that the canal's operating history has encountered and managed before. The case for treating this as a genuinely escalating risk comes from three sources. First, the Samuel Munoz study in Geophysical Research Letters found that under higher emissions pathways, the occurrence of historic droughts like 2023 would double by the end of the 21st century. The trend in Panama's long-term rainfall projections under warming scenarios is toward drying, even if that trend is not yet statistically detectable in the historical record. Second, the Woodwell Climate Research Center analysis noted that global warming of 1.35 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, a level that 2023 set as a new annual record, increases evaporation from Gatún Lake, reducing effective water storage even in years when rainfall is near average. Third, the canal's water demand has been growing. The 2016 expansion added a new lane of Neo-Panamax locks that serve larger vessels, and the total daily water budget for canal operations has increased with the expansion's utilization. Growing water demand against a potentially shrinking and more variable water supply is a trajectory that does not require long-term trend analysis to identify as a concern. The Woodwell climate analysis framed the directional question precisely. Under high emission scenarios in which we don't get warming in check, El Niño events could become 15 to 20% stronger. A 15 to 20% stronger El Niño, arriving in 2027, would produce a Gatún Lake deficit potentially worse than 2023, before the Indio River Dam is complete, before the NGL pipeline is operational, and against a global shipping network that has been partially restructured around the assumption that the Panama Canal is sometimes unreliable. The Panama Canal crisis is typically framed in terms of global shipping and supply chains, the big ships, the big numbers, the global price tag. The framing is accurate but incomplete. Gatún Lake does not only power the lock system, it also supplies the drinking water for approximately 55% of Panama's population. Panama City, with a metropolitan population of approximately 1.5 million people, draws its municipal water supply from the Gatún Lake watershed. Colón, Panama's second largest city on the Atlantic coast, also draws from the same source. When Gatún Lake's level fell to its lowest January 1st reading on record at the start of 2024, this was not only a crisis for the container ships waiting in the Pacific approaches. It was a water supply crisis for the residents of one of the fastest growing capital cities in Central America. The compound demand on Gatún Lake, for canal operations consuming 7 billion liters per day, and for municipal water supply serving millions of people, means that the two demand systems are in direct competition during low water periods. The canal's operational water budget dwarfs the municipal supply demand. As the RTI water management analysis notes, the municipal and other non-canal uses represent a small fraction of the lake's total water budget. But at critically low water levels, every liter saved in canal operations is a liter that could maintain municipal supply pressure, and vice versa. The 2023 drought produced water supply disruptions in communities throughout the canal zone, with reports of rationing, reduced pressure, and quality concerns in neighborhoods dependent on the system. For the residents of rural communities in the canal watershed, communities that already face the prospect of displacement if the Indio River Dam project proceeds, the drought was both a lived crisis and a preview of the compound future that climate change is building. Less reliable rainfall, more competition for the water that falls, and a canal administration making operational decisions that balance the demands of global shipping against the needs of local populations, who are rarely included in the diplomatic and economic conversations about the canal's strategic importance.
The Greenlee.Earth analysis of the Indio River project noted the fundamental tension. The new reservoir is intended to provide both additional canal water and drinking water for over half of Panama's population. It is described simultaneously as a national water security project and as a trade infrastructure project. Both framings are accurate, and the dual justification is in part what drove the political approval in January 2025. But the social and environmental costs of displacing 2,500 people and flooding 4,600 hectares of forest fall entirely on Panamanian residents and ecosystems, while the primary economic beneficiaries of the additional transit capacity the reservoir enables are the global shipping companies, energy traders, and commodity exporters whose vessels will use the additional slots.
The honest assessment of the Panama Canal's water crisis requires presenting three interpretations of the trajectory, each consistent with parts of the available data, each carrying different implications for global supply chain planning. Scenario 1, the managed stabilization case. The Indio River Dam and NGL pipeline projects proceed on their announced timelines, with construction beginning in 2027 and completion in 2032 for the dam. The next El Niño cycle, if it arrives in 2027 as projected, produces a drought comparable to 2023. The canal again imposes restrictions, ships reroute, prices spike. But the disruption is managed within the range of what the global shipping industry has already demonstrated it can absorb and adapt to during 2023 and 2024. By 2032, the new reservoir is online, adding 15 daily transit capacity during dry seasons, and the canal's vulnerability to El Niño-scale drought events is substantially reduced. The NGL pipeline, once operational, provides LNG and LPG exporters with a canal-independent route that eliminates their exposure to water-level-driven restrictions. Under this scenario, the 2023 crisis serves as the inflection point that forced a necessary infrastructure upgrade. Expensive, disruptive, but ultimately producing a more resilient system. This scenario is possible. The Canal Authority is genuinely investing in adaptation. The political approval was achieved, the legal barriers were cleared, the financing is being assembled. Panama has a strong institutional interest in maintaining the canal's reliability. Canal revenues fund a significant fraction of the national budget. The engineering solutions are known and technically straightforward. The question is whether the timeline can be compressed and whether the next El Niño cycle provides the political breathing room needed to complete construction before the next major crisis. Scenario 2, the recurring disruption case. The Indio River Dam is delayed by legal challenges, community resistance, and the technical complexity of a $1.6 billion infrastructure project in a challenging environment. Construction does not begin until 2028 or 2029. The 2027 El Niño produces a drought comparable to 2023, possibly more severe if El Niño events are strengthening as projected under higher emission scenarios, with the canal again operating at reduced capacity for a year or more. By 2027, however, LNG operators have already adapted their routing away from canal dependence. The grain trade has developed more diversified routing strategies, and the global shipping industry has built greater redundancy into its planning. The disruption occurs again, produces real economic costs, but does not produce the shock that 2023 produced, because the industry has already priced in the canal's intermittent unreliability. Under this scenario, the canal's role in global trade gradually diminishes from an absolutely critical link to an important but occasionally unavailable one, a demotion with lasting economic consequences for Panama and lasting logistical consequences for U.S.-Asia trade. The evidence for this scenario is the behavioral stickiness documented in the LNG sector's continued preference for the Cape of Good Hope route, even after the canal's operational recovery. Shipping industries do not reconfigure their routing economics on short timescales. Once the adaptation costs are sunk, new contracts, new scheduling frameworks, new operational procedures, the inducement to return to canal dependence requires not just a functioning canal, but a demonstrably reliable one. The 2023 crisis has created a reputational shadow over the canal's reliability that the infrastructure projects may not fully dispel. Scenario 3, the structural deterioration case. Samuel Munoz's Geophysical Research Letters study found that under high-emission scenarios, droughts like 2023 will double in frequency by the end of the century. If the long-term drying trajectory for Central America, under warming scenarios, materializes at the pace the higher-end climate models project, the Indio River Dam, designed and sized based on 21st century climate projections through 2032, may be insufficient to buffer the lake levels against the droughts that could characterize the 2044 and 2050 climate in the Chagres watershed. Under this scenario, the global shipping industry's adaptation is not a temporary rerouting crisis, but the beginning of a permanent reorientation of transoceanic shipping away from canal-dependent routes. a transformation comparable to the one that the opening of the canal in 1914 imposed on the global shipping system, but in reverse. This scenario is the most speculative and the most consequential. It is grounded in the climate modeling that Muñoz and colleagues published, and in the broader literature on Central American climate projections under warming scenarios. It requires that emissions continue at the higher end trajectory and that the local climate response in Panama tracks the more severe projections. Both conditions are uncertain. But Muñoz himself stated clearly, if we mitigate emissions and we choose one of the lower emissions pathways, then it really keeps this system pretty stable. The scenario is not a certainty. It is a conditional. If the global community does not substantially reduce emissions, the Panama Canal faces a future in which its freshwater dependency becomes an increasingly binding constraint on its operational reliability. Let's inventory what the data establishes with confidence, what is probable, and what remains genuinely uncertain. What is established? Panama experienced its third driest year on record in 2023, with rainfall in the Chagres watershed 30% below average. On January 1, 2024, Gatún Lake water levels were the lowest recorded for that date in the lake's history, approximately 6 feet below January 1, 2023 levels. The World Weather Attribution Analysis found that the drought was unlikely without El Niño's influence, and that under current warming conditions, similar droughts have approximately a 5% probability of occurring in any given El Niño year. What is established? The Panama Canal Authority reduced daily vessel transits from a normal 36 to 38, reaching a nadir of 18 per day by February 2024. This restriction persisted for more than a year before full operational capacity was restored in August 2024. Total vessel transits declined 29% in fiscal year 2024. LNG transits fell 66%. Dry bulk transits fell 107%. Individual transit slot auctions reached $4 million. By late August 2023, 135 ships were waiting to cross, 50% above normal. What is established? 94% of U.S. LNG destined for Asia used the Cape of Good Hope route in 2024, compared to a pre-drought pattern in which the Panama Canal handled the majority of that traffic. For Japan specifically, the share using the Cape of Good Hope went from 13% before the drought to 81% during and after it. Grain exporters shifted from 85% canal usage to 15% in a single season. What is established? The compound disruption with the Suez Canal, simultaneously restricted by Houthi attacks beginning in November 2023, produced the first modern-era simultaneous throttling of both primary inter-ocean maritime shortcuts. UNCTAD projected global consumer price increases of 0.6% from the compound disruption if sustained through 2025. Cape of Good Hope rerouting surged 89%. A typical large container ship diverting around Africa incurred $400,000 in additional emissions costs per voyage under the EU ETS alone. What is not established, whether the 2027 El Niño projection will materialize on schedule or at the severity that would produce a drought comparable to 2023. Whether the Indio River Dam will be completed on the 2032 target timeline or delayed further by legal, environmental, and construction challenges. Whether the behavioral shift of LNG and grain trade routing away from canal dependence will prove temporary, reversing as the canal demonstrates sustained reliability, or structural. What is not established? The long-term rainfall trajectory for Panama's Chagres watershed under various emissions scenarios. Muñoz's geophysical research letters study explicitly acknowledge uncertainty in Central American climate projections, noting that this is a region of the world where climate scientists still aren't 100% sure exactly what will happen. The directional signal points toward more frequent and more severe droughts under higher emissions, but the magnitude and timing of that deterioration remain uncertain. There is a structural insight embedded in the Panama Canal drought story that extends beyond the canal itself, and it is an insight that the global supply chain management community has been discussing in academic and professional circles for years without it generating the public conversation it deserves. Modern global supply chains were designed and optimized under an implicit assumption that the physical infrastructure connecting production regions to consumption regions, the ports, the shipping lanes, the canal choke points, would be reliably available on the timescale of business planning. Just-in-time manufacturing, lean inventory management, and the globalization of production that moved factories to the lowest cost locations on Earth were all predicated on the reliability of maritime logistics. If a factory in Shenzhen can reliably ship a product to a warehouse in Ohio in 22 days, an Ohio retailer can hold minimal inventory. reducing storage costs, reducing capital tied up in goods sitting on shelves, and improving the responsiveness of the supply chain to consumer demand signals. The 2023 Panama Canal crisis, compounded by the simultaneous Suez disruption, demonstrated that the infrastructure reliability assumption is conditional, not absolute. When the conditions change, whether because a lake dries up or because armed groups attack ships, the 22-day transit becomes a 60-day transit. The supply chain built on 22-day reliability is not built on 60-day reliability. The lean inventory that works perfectly when the ship arrives on schedule becomes a stockout when the ship is rerouting around Africa. The McKinsey assessment noted that the Panama Canal situation and the Red Sea situation together constituted a sharp reminder about the importance of supply chain resilience. The phrasing is apt. The reminder is sharp because the industries most affected, automotive, electronics, just-in-time manufacturing, are precisely the industries that invested most heavily in the efficiency improvements that lean global supply chains enable, and that have the lowest buffer capacity when those supply chains are disrupted. The industries that fared best during the 2023 to 2024 disruption were those that had already built supply chain redundancy, that maintained relationships with multiple suppliers in multiple geographies, that held higher than minimum inventory levels of critical components, and that had developed routing flexibility through experience with prior disruptions. The industries that struggled most were those that had optimized most aggressively for efficiency and had effectively bet their supply chain resilience on the continued smooth operation of infrastructure they did not control. The lesson, build redundancy, maintain inventory buffers, develop routing flexibility, is not complicated. It is also not cheap. Supply chain redundancy costs money. Inventory buffers tie up capital. Routing flexibility requires relationships with multiple logistics providers across multiple corridors. For companies whose competitive advantage is built on supply chain efficiency, investing in resilience is an investment in surviving disruptions, but it is an investment that looks wasteful in the absence of disruptions. The calculation only changes after a crisis like 2023 makes the cost of non-resilience visible. There is a parallel story embedded in the Panama Canal drought that deserves specific mention because it illustrates the supply chain lesson at a different scale. The story of what the crisis did to Panama's own economy and the choices that nation faces in adapting its most valuable infrastructure asset to a warming climate. Panama is not a large economy. Its GDP is approximately $70 billion, roughly comparable to a mid-sized U.S. state. Canal revenues constitute a critical fraction of the national budget. The Panama Canal Authority's fiscal year 2024 revenue of $3.38 billion represents an extraordinary share of a small country's fiscal base, and the revenue transfers from the authority to the National Treasury Fund schools, hospitals, and public services for Panamanian citizens. When canal transits fall 29%, the downstream effect on Panamanian government revenue is not abstract. It is a reduction in the fiscal capacity to fund public services, in a country where those services are already constrained. The drought's effect on Panama's domestic water supply, detailed in Part 14 of this investigation, adds an additional dimension. A government trying to simultaneously maintain canal operations, maintain municipal water supply for its capital city, manage the political and legal complexity of the Indio River Dam project, and preserve its relationships with the international shipping community and the United States government is navigating a set of competing priorities that would challenge a government with far more resources than Panama has. The United States' political engagement with the canal, including the public statements from President Trump in the early months of 2025 about potential U.S. interest in reasserting influence over the canal, added geopolitical complexity to an already challenging situation. Whatever the ultimate diplomatic outcome of those statements, their effect in Panama was to inject uncertainty into a national dialogue about the canal's future that was already complicated by the drought crisis, the infrastructure investment decisions, and the environmental and social controversies surrounding the Indio River Dam. The broader geopolitical dimension of canal reliability extends beyond U.S.-Panama bilateral relations. China, which has significant commercial interests in Panama's port infrastructure through investments by C.K. Hutchison Holdings in port operations at both ends of the canal, has its own strategic interest in maintaining access to a reliable transoceanic chokepoint. The canal's reliability affects Chinese shipping companies, Chinese agricultural imports, and Chinese manufactured goods exports. The 2023 crisis was a vivid demonstration to every major global trading nation that the physical infrastructure of their supply chains has vulnerabilities that political and financial hedging cannot fully eliminate. that the weather in a specific drainage basin in a small Central American country can move the price of goods in Tokyo, London, and Houston. The supply chain resilience conversation that the 2023 crisis reopened is not a conversation about whether global trade is good or bad, or whether supply chains should be shorter or longer. It is a conversation about the specific physical dependencies that the current structure of global trade has created, and about whether those dependencies are being managed with the seriousness that their consequences demand when they fail. The Panama Canal's operational recovery in August 2024 was real. The crisis has passed. The lake is back to operating levels. The daily transit count is back to the normal range. The world's goods are, for now, moving through the 51 miles of the Panamanian Isthmus at the pace the global supply chain has been built to expect. But the conditions that produced the crisis have not been resolved. They have been managed, temporarily, by the return of normal rainfall during the 2024 rainy season. The climate physics that made the 2023 drought possible. The combination of El Niño's rainfall suppression and the background warming that increases evaporation and raises the baseline atmospheric temperature above Panama have not changed. The infrastructure solutions that would provide structural protection against the next drought are years from completion. The next El Niño cycle is projected for approximately 2027. Samuel Munoz's summary of the strategic position is worth stating plainly. We are at a crossroads where the world can mitigate emissions that would stabilize Gatún Lake water levels. But if we head down a pathway of less mitigation, the Panama Canal will continue to face operational challenges in the coming decades. The crossroads metaphor is honest about what is at stake. One path leads toward a stabilized system where infrastructure investment and emissions mitigation together protect the canal's reliability. The other leads toward a system of recurring, deepening droughts that progressively erode the reliability of the most important geographic chokepoint in global trade. The metrics this investigation will follow going forward are specific. The Gatún Lake Level Indicator, published by the Panama Canal Authority, updated daily and available on the authority's public website, is the most direct operational signal of how the system is performing against its normal seasonal baseline. When the lake level enters the zone below 81 feet, the authority begins imposing restrictions. When it approaches 79 feet, the operational environment becomes critical. The NOAA climate models that track El Niño development, specifically the ENSO forecast products updated monthly, will show whether the 2027 El Niño projection materializes and at what strength. The construction status of the Indio River Dam and NGL pipeline projects, as reported in Panama Canal Authority press releases and Panamanian government communications, will show whether the adaptation timeline is tracking toward completion or slipping. The total annual vessel transits, reported quarterly by the Panama Canal Authority, will show whether the LNG and grain trade routes that shifted away from canal dependence during the drought have returned to pre-drought patterns, or whether the behavioral shift is proving permanent. That number is perhaps the most consequential leading indicator of how the global shipping industry is assessing the canal's long-term reliability. The specific cargo categories that matter most for early warning monitoring are the ones that moved first and most dramatically during the 2023 crisis. LNG carriers and very large gas carriers, whose transit numbers fell 66% and whose routing shift to the Cape of Good Hope has proven the most durable of any cargo category. Dry bulk carriers, whose 107% year-over-year transit decline reflected the almost total abandonment of the Panama route for U.S. grain exports to Asia during the crisis period. And container vessels, whose 24.6% share of total transits proved relatively resilient during the crisis, but which would bear significant disruption in any repeat event that lasts long enough to affect the just-in-time consumer goods supply chains that the canal carries. The Panama Canal opened in 1914 as the supreme engineering achievement of the industrial age, a feat that cut 6 months of sailing time from the Trans-Pacific voyage and reshaped the geography of world trade more dramatically than any other single infrastructure project in history. More than a century later, it runs on the same water it always has, rain falling on a watershed in central Panama, flowing into an artificial lake, cascading by gravity through lock chambers, and lifting the world's trade over a mountain range 50 miles wide. The engineering is unchanged, the climate is not. And the 6 billion gallons of water that the Panama Canal uses every day, dispatched to the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans with every transit, can only be replaced by one thing: precipitation over one specific watershed, in one specific country, in one specific season of the year.
When the rain comes, the world's goods move. When it does not, as 2023 demonstrated in numbers the Canal Authority, the shipping industry, and the global supply chain community will not soon forget. The most efficient, most cost-effective, most strategically important maritime route in the world becomes a parking lot for ships, a driver of inflation, and a lesson in how thin the margin between normal and crisis actually is. We will be here watching the lake level. We will be here when the next El Niño forecast sharpens. And we will be here to tell you, with the same specificity this investigation has used throughout, exactly what the monitoring data shows before the supply chain feels it.